How CIA agents created a fake sci-fi movie to rescue diplomats. The Revolutionary Guard officer held up the Canadian passport, examining it under the harsh fluorescent light at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. His eyes moved from the photograph to the face of the nervous man standing before him, then back again. The passport identified him as Joseph Harris, a production manager for a Hollywood film crew scouting locations in Iran for a science fiction movie called Argo. Behind him, 5 other members of the supposed Canadian film crew stood in a loose formation, their faces carefully neutral, their hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The officer's finger traced the visa stamp recently issued by the Iranian Interests Section in Ottawa, and his lips moved silently as he read the entry documentation that claimed these 6 foreigners had arrived to scout exotic locations for a movie about aliens and ancient civilizations. In truth, none of them were filmmakers. They were American diplomats who had been hiding in Tehran for 3 months, and if this Revolutionary Guard officer realized that fact in the next 60 seconds, they would all be taken to Evin Prison, interrogated, and likely executed as spies. The crisis had begun on November 4, 1979, a date that would mark the beginning of a 44-day nightmare that fundamentally altered American foreign policy and ended a presidency. On that cool autumn morning, thousands of Iranian students and militants, inflamed by revolutionary fervor and anti-American sentiment, stormed the United States Embassy compound in Tehran. They overwhelmed the limited Marine Guard contingent, who had been ordered not to use deadly force against Iranian civilians, and systematically seized the buildings that comprised America's diplomatic presence in Iran. Within hours, 52 American diplomats and citizens became hostages, paraded before cameras, bound and blindfolded, their capture broadcast worldwide as a symbol of America's impotence and Iran's revolutionary triumph. The images shocked Americans who had grown accustomed to viewing their nation as powerful and their citizens as protected by that power. Suddenly, the world witnessed American diplomats held captive, subjected to mock executions, psychological torture, and the constant threat of trial and execution as spies. The Iranian revolutionaries, led by radical students loyal to Ayatollah Khomeini, demanded the return of the deposed Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled to the United States for medical treatment after being overthrown earlier that year. What the world did not know, what the media did not report, and what even many within the U.S. government did not initially realize was that 6 Americans had escaped. When the militants first breached the embassy walls, consular officers Robert Anders, Mark Lejek, Cora Lejek, Henry Schatz, Joseph Stafford, and Kathleen Stafford had been working in the consulate building, a OSAB, separate structure from the main embassy. They heard the commotion, saw the crowds surging through the compound, and made a split-second decision that saved their lives. Instead of following standard procedure and moving to the embassy's secure vault rooms, where the other Americans were gathering, they slipped out a side door and fled into the chaotic streets of Tehran. They had no plan, no extraction route prepared, and no clear understanding of where they could find safety in a city that had transformed overnight into hostile territory. They only knew that staying meant capture, and capture meant becoming bargaining chips in a crisis that could end with their execution. The 6 Americans spent their first night of freedom hiding in the apartment of an Iranian employee of the British Embassy, a man who risked his own life to shelter them temporarily. The next morning, they made their way separately through Tehran streets to the Canadian Embassy, hoping that Canada's diplomatic mission might offer sanctuary that the American compound could no longer provide. Canadian Ambassador Ken Taylor answered his door to find desperate American diplomats asking for help that would require him to violate diplomatic protocols, potentially destroy his career, and risk an international incident that could endanger Canadian-Iranian relations. Without hesitation, Taylor brought them inside. He and his first secretary, John Sheardown, made the decision that morning to hide the Americans indefinitely, understanding that this choice transformed them from neutral diplomats into active participants in a high-stakes deception. Over the following weeks, Taylor and his staff created false identities for the 6 Americans, distributed them between his own residence and Sheardown's home, and maintained the fiction that they were visiting Canadian officials whenever Iranian security forces conducted neighborhood sweeps or document checks. In Washington, the crisis escalated daily throughout November and December. President Jimmy Carter faced mounting pressure to take military action, rescue the hostages by force, or negotiate their release through concessions that would humiliate the United States and validate the revolutionary regime's tactics. The 6 Americans hiding in Tehran represented a separate problem that received far less public attention but carried equally dangerous implications. The State Department and CIA knew that maintaining their cover in Tehran indefinitely was impossible. Eventually, Iranian counterintelligence would discover that 6 American diplomats were unaccounted for, would begin searching for them systematically, and would likely identify the Canadian embassy as their hiding place. When that happened, Iran would have leverage to demand even more concessions. The crisis would expand beyond the 52 hostages to potentially include Canadian diplomats, and the 6 Americans would face interrogation that would compromise intelligence operations throughout the region. Something had to be done, but every conventional extraction option carried unacceptable risks. Smuggling them out through Turkey or Pakistan required weeks of dangerous overland travel through areas controlled by Revolutionary Guards and hostile militias. Extracting them by helicopter meant conducting a military operation deep inside Iranian territory with almost certain casualties. Attempting to forge documents and simply drive them to the airport had been tried and failed in other cases, with Iranian security growing increasingly sophisticated in detecting false papers. Into this impossible situation walked Tony Mendez, a CIA technical operations officer whose career had been built on solving problems that existed at the intersection of espionage and practical deception. Mendez was not a traditional intelligence officer in the mold of Ivy League analysts or paramilitary operators. He had grown up in small-town Nevada, studied art and design before joining the CIA in the 1960s, and spent his career in the Office of Technical Service, the division responsible for creating disguises, forged documents, and operational tools that enabled field operatives to conduct clandestine missions. He was an expert in what the agency called exfiltration, the art of extracting intelligence assets or personnel from hostile environments using deception rather than force. Over 15 years, Mendez had engineered escapes from Soviet bloc countries, Southeast Asian war zones, and Middle Eastern dictatorships, always relying on the principle that the most effective disguise was one so mundane, so consistent with normal activity that security forces never thought to question it deeply. When Mendez was briefed on the situation in Tehran in early January 1980, he immediately understood the challenge's unique parameters. The 6 Americans were already in a relatively safe location, but they could not stay there indefinitely without discovery. They needed documentation that would allow them to pass through Mehrabad Airport's increasingly paranoid security checkpoints, where Revolutionary Guards were searching for American spies and counter-revolutionaries with obsessive intensity. Any extraction plan had to provide cover stories that explained why 6 foreigners were in Tehran during a period when most Westerners had fled, why they were leaving now, and what they had been doing that required them to enter Iran in the first place. The cover had to be complex enough to withstand scrutiny, but simple enough that the Americans, who had no training in deep cover operations, could maintain it under interrogation. Most critically, it had to be verifiable, meaning the Iranian government had to be able to check elements of the story and find them apparently genuine. Mendez spent days considering and rejecting scenarios, posing the Americans as teachers would require documentation from schools that Iranian officials could easily verify did not exist. Claiming they were business executives would invite questions about which Iranian companies they represented and why those companies would employ foreigners during revolutionary upheaval. Presenting them as journalists would make them targets for arrest as spies, given Iran's hostility to Western media. Every conventional cover story collapsed under examination because Iran's revolutionary government had specifically tightened controls to prevent exactly this kind of deception. The breakthrough came while Mendez was watching television at his home in suburban Virginia, half paying attention to a science fiction movie while his mind worked through the problem. He noticed the film's credits acknowledging various countries where location shooting had occurred, exotic landscapes in North Africa and the Middle East that provided alien vistas for the story's otherworldly settings. The idea crystallized with sudden clarity. What if the Americans were not in Iran for diplomatic or business reasons, but for something so unusual, so Hollywood, that Iranian security would never think to fabricate such an elaborate cover? What if they were a film crew scouting locations for a science fiction movie? The concept seemed absurd at first consideration, but as Mendez developed it, the operational logic became compelling. Film crews traveled to exotic and politically unstable locations regularly, seeking authentic landscapes that could not be replicated on sound stages. They employed small advance teams that included producers, production managers, and location scouts, exactly 6 people in many cases. They required visas and permits that explained their presence officially, documented their activities through photographs and notes, and departed after brief stays once location scouting was completed. Most importantly, the cover could be verified because Mendez could actually create a real Hollywood production with all the surface legitimacy that Iranian officials might check: office space, trade advertisements, and public documentation. If Iranian security called the production company's office, someone would answer. If they searched industry publications, they would find announcements of the film project. If they investigated the company's corporate registration, it would check out. The deception would not be 6 Americans pretending to be something they were not. It would be 6 Americans participating in an actual film production that simply happened to be fake. Mendez presented the plan to his superiors at CIA headquarters in Langley, knowing it sounded like something from a spy novel rather than serious tradecraft. The initial reaction was skeptical, bordering on dismissive. Agency veterans questioned whether such an elaborate deception could be maintained, whether the Americans hiding in Tehran could convincingly portray film professionals, and whether investing resources in creating a fake Hollywood movie was a rational use of intelligence assets. But as other extraction options were examined and rejected, and as the timeline for discovery grew shorter with each passing week, the Hollywood cover story began to appear less absurd and more like the only viable approach. By mid-January, Mendez received authorization to proceed with developing what would become known as the Canadian Caper, a joint CIA-Canadian operation to exfiltrate the 6 Americans under cover of a fake science fiction film production. The first challenge was finding someone in Hollywood who could help create a production that looked legitimate to industry insiders and Iranian investigators. Mendez reached out to John Chambers, a legendary makeup artist who had won an Academy Award for his work on Planet of the Apes, and who maintained a secret relationship with the CIA as a consultant on disguise and deception operations. Chambers understood immediately what Mendez needed and introduced him to Robert Siddell, a producer who could navigate Hollywood's business infrastructure. Together, the 3 men set about building Studio 6 Productions, a company that existed solely to provide cover for a CIA extraction operation. but that would appear to any outside observer as a small independent production company developing a science fiction adventure film. They rented office space on the Sunset Strip, installed telephones and office equipment, and hired a secretary who answered calls with professional Hollywood efficiency, completely unaware that her employer was a CIA front organization. The film itself needed a script, or at least the appearance of one. Chambers located a science fiction screenplay called Lord of Light, written by Barry Geller and inspired by Roger Zelazny's award-winning novel about a far future society where technology and mythology merged. The script had been in development for years but had never been produced, languishing in the legal and financial complications that often trapped ambitious, independent films. Chambers negotiated rights to use the concept and materials, which included elaborate conceptual artwork by the famous comic book artist Jack Kirby depicting alien landscapes and futuristic architecture. Mendes rebranded the project Argo, choosing the name from Greek mythology's heroic voyage, finding dark humor in the fact that the original Argo's journey had been filled with deception and narrow escapes. Studio 6 Productions announced Argo as an upcoming science fiction epic that would require location scouting in the Middle East to find desert landscapes capable of representing alien worlds. The establishment of Argo's Hollywood legitimacy proceeded with meticulous attention to detail throughout late January. Trade publications like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter ran announcements about the project, small items in their production news sections that mentioned Studio 6 Productions and the science fiction adventure being developed for international locations. Mendes created professional promotional materials, full-color brochures featuring Kirby's spectacular artwork, concept illustrations that depicted an ancient Persian aesthetic merged with futuristic technology. The promotional materials were exactly what a small production company would create to attract investors and generate industry interest, glossy enough to look professional, but not so expensive that they suggested a major studio budget. If Iranian intelligence investigated Argo, they would find these materials in Hollywood offices, mentioned in trade publications, discussed in industry circles. The deception extended beyond simple documentation to create what intelligence professionals call operational depth, multiple layers of verifiable information that reinforce the cover story even under sustained investigation. By early February, Studio 6 Productions had achieved sufficient Hollywood credibility that Mendes felt confident moving to the next phase. He needed to travel to Tehran personally to assess the security situation, brief the 6 Americans on their roles, and ensure they could maintain the cover story under pressure. The Canadians arranged documentation identifying Mendes as a Hollywood production manager traveling on a Canadian passport under the name Kevin Costa Harkins. The identity was supported by the same depth of false documentation that would later protect the 6 Americans, credit cards, business cards identifying him as associated with Studio 6 Productions, and a backstory that positioned him as advanced scout for the Argo location team. Mendes flew from Washington to Frankfurt to Istanbul, following an indirect route that reduced the chance of surveillance tracking his movements, and finally to Tehran on January 25, 1980. As his plane descended toward Mehrabad Airport, he looked out at the city spread below, its streets filled with revolutionary fervor and anti-American rage, and understood that he was walking into an environment where discovery meant his own capture in addition to the 6 diplomats he was trying to save. Mendes passed through Iranian customs and immigration with his Canadian documents, answering questions about his purpose in Tehran with practiced ease. He claimed to be scouting locations for a Hollywood production, showed the immigration officer Argo promotional materials, and explained that he would be meeting with Iranian film liaison offices to discuss permit requirements. The officer examined his passport, stamped it without particular interest, and waved him through. The ease of entry was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. It demonstrated that the cover story worked on initial inspection, but it also reminded Mendez how quickly the situation could reverse if Iranian counterintelligence decided to investigate more thoroughly. He took a taxi to the Canadian embassy, where Ambassador Taylor had arranged a private meeting away from potential surveillance, and for the first time met the 6 Americans whose lives depended on his deception. The meeting took place in Ambassador Taylor's residence, a comfortable diplomatic home that had become a prison for the Americans, hiding within its walls. Robert Anders, Mark and Cora Lijek, Henry Schatz, and Joseph and Kathleen Stafford had spent nearly 3 months in concealment, unable to venture outside except for brief, carefully monitored walks, watching the hostage crisis unfold on television with the knowledge that their colleagues remained captive while they hid in relative safety. The psychological strain was evident in their faces, the tension of prolonged uncertainty combined with survivors' guilt and the constant fear of discovery. Mendez studied them carefully, assessing whether these diplomats, trained for negotiation and consular work rather than espionage, could convincingly portray Hollywood film professionals under interrogation by suspicious Revolutionary Guards. His first impression was not encouraging. They looked frightened, which was understandable, but they also looked like exactly what they were: American government employees trying unsuccessfully to appear relaxed. Mendez explained the extraction plan in detail, walking them through every element of the cover story they would need to maintain. They would be presented as a Canadian film crew, production manager, associate producer, director, cinematographer, art director, and script consultant, working for Studio 6 Productions on a science fiction film called Argo that required Middle Eastern locations. They would carry Canadian passports issued under false names but genuine documents provided by the Canadian government in an unprecedented act of cooperation that violated standard diplomatic protocols. They would have business cards, production materials, and detailed knowledge of the film industry sufficient to answer basic questions. Most critically, they would need to believe their cover stories completely, inhabiting their roles so thoroughly that they projected confidence rather than fear when facing Iranian security. Mendez emphasized that revolutionary authorities at the airport would be looking for nervousness, inconsistencies, and signs of deception. If the Americans appeared uncertain or frightened, guards would investigate further. If they projected the casual arrogance that Hollywood film people often carried into foreign countries, treating Iranian officials as minor obstacles to their important creative work, they might pass inspection through sheer audacity. The training that followed over the next few days was intensive and psychologically demanding. Mendez drilled the 6 Americans on film industry terminology, teaching them to discuss production schedules, location requirements, and creative decisions with sufficient fluency that they sounded credible. He showed them Argo promotional materials, the elaborate artwork and story concepts they would supposedly be developing, and had them practice explaining why Iran's deserts and historical architecture made perfect locations for alien worlds. He conducted mock interrogations, playing the role of suspicious airport security and asking questions designed to trip them up or expose inconsistencies in their stories. When they faltered or showed fear, he pushed harder, explaining that Iranian Revolutionary Guards would be far more intimidating and far less patient than he was being. The Americans had to learn not just to recite cover stories, but to genuinely inhabit them, responding to questions with the reflexive confidence of people discussing their real professions rather than desperately maintaining false identities. Ambassador Taylor and his staff supported the preparation by helping the Americans develop their Canadian personas beyond simple memorization of biographical details. They coached them on Canadian pronunciation, the subtle ways Canadians said "about," and process, that differed from American speech patterns. They briefed them on Canadian geography, politics, and culture, details that might come up in casual conversation with Iranian officials or fellow passengers. They practiced signing their false names until the signatures looked natural rather than carefully constructed forgeries. Every element of the deception had to become second nature, automatic responses that would hold up under stress when adrenaline and fear made careful thought difficult. Mendez watched the transformation with professional satisfaction, seeing the Americans gradually shift from frightened diplomats to credible film professionals, or at least people who could maintain that appearance long enough to clear airport security. The final element of preparation involved intelligence gathering that Mendez needed to conduct personally. He could not simply fly the Americans to the airport and hope the deception held. He needed to understand what security procedures they would face, which checkpoints required, which documentation, and where the greatest risks of discovery existed. Over several days, Mendez conducted reconnaissance at Mehrabad Airport, posing as a location scout, photographing potential sites for Argo. He walked through the departure terminals, observing the layers of security that travelers had to pass, noting where Revolutionary Guards concentrated their attention and where they conducted cursory inspections. He watched how they examined documents, which stamps and seals they looked for on passports and visas, and how they reacted to foreign travelers claiming various purposes for visiting Iran. The intelligence he gathered was sobering. Security had intensified significantly since the embassy takeover, with multiple checkpoints requiring documentation and questioning before travelers could even reach departure gates. If you're still watching this moment that could have ended in execution or decades of imprisonment, if you believe some missions require absolute commitment to an impossible deception, go ahead and like this video and comment the word extraction below. Let's see how many of us understand that sometimes the most elaborate lies serve the most necessary truths. By mid-February, Mendez determined that the operation was as ready as it could be. Further delay would only increase the risk of discovery as Iranian counterintelligence continued searching for the missing Americans. He communicated with CIA headquarters through encrypted channels, confirming that all elements were in place and requesting final authorization to proceed with the extraction. The message that came back approved the operation, but emphasized that Mendez and the Americans would be on their own once they entered the airport. If something went wrong, if Iranian security detained them for questioning, the United States government would deny any knowledge of the operation to protect the Canadians and avoid escalating the hostage crisis. The 6 Americans would be arrested, interrogated, and likely tried as spies. Mendez himself would face the same fate, his CIA career ending in an Iranian prison. The stakes were existential, and the margin for error was non-existent. The Canadian government played its role with extraordinary courage and diplomatic risk. External Affairs Minister Flora MacDonald personally approved the issuance of 6 genuine Canadian passports under false names, documentation that violated Canada's own laws and could create an international scandal if discovered. The passports were not forgeries but actual government documents, complete with proper stamps, seals, and serial numbers that would pass any verification Iranian officials might conduct. Canadian immigration officials backdated entry stamps to suggest the film crew had arrived in Tehran several weeks earlier, creating a paper trail that explained their presence during the period when most Western visitors had evacuated. The Canadian embassy in Tehran provided business visas issued through official channels, documentation that Iranian authorities had themselves processed and approved without realizing they were facilitating an American intelligence operation. Every element of the false documentation was designed to be verifiable because it was, in the most technical sense, real. January 27, 1980 was selected as the extraction date. Mendez chose a morning departure on Swiss Air Flight 363 to Zurich, reasoning that early flights faced less intensive security scrutiny than afternoon departures and that Swiss aircraft were less likely to be singled out for special inspection than American carriers. The plan called for the 6 Americans to travel as 2 separate groups to avoid presenting a suspiciously large party, with Mendez accompanying the first group and the second following 15 minutes later. If the first group was detained, the second might still escape, or at least avoid immediate capture. It was cold comfort, but intelligence operations rarely offered better options. The night before departure, Mendez conducted a final briefing, emphasizing that they should maintain their roles from the moment they left the Canadian embassy until they were airborne and out of Iranian airspace. Any break in character, any moment of dropped guard, could trigger the suspicion that would unravel everything. The morning of the extraction, Tehran was cold and gray, the winter sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. Ambassador Taylor's driver loaded luggage into the embassy car, suitcases that contained clothes and personal items, but also production materials, Argo promotional brochures, script pages, and location photographs that reinforced their cover as a film crew departing after completing location scouts. The first group, Mendez with Robert Anders, Mark Lijek, and Cora Lijek, departed the embassy at 6:15 in the morning. They rode in silence through Tehran's awakening streets, past Revolutionary Guard checkpoints and walls plastered with anti-American propaganda, toward Mehrabad Airport and the gauntlet of security inspections that stood between them and freedom. Mendez watched the Americans' faces carefully, looking for signs of panic or loss of nerve. He saw fear, which was unavoidable, but also determination. They understood that this was their only chance, that turning back meant waiting for inevitable discovery, and that their survival depended entirely on maintaining the deception he had constructed. Mehrabad Airport in January 1980 was a place of controlled chaos and paranoid vigilance. The terminal building, once a symbol of Iran's modernization under the Shah, had been transformed into a revolutionary checkpoint where security forces looked for enemies and spies with obsessive intensity. Travelers moved through multiple inspection stations, each requiring documentation, questioning, and the approval of guards who wielded absolute authority with minimal oversight. Mendez and his group approached the first checkpoint, where a Revolutionary Guard officer examined their Canadian passports and asked their purpose in Iran. Mendez responded in his practiced cover, explaining they were film production personnel departing after scouting locations for a Hollywood movie. He showed the officer Argo promotional materials, glossy brochures featuring Jack Kirby's spectacular artwork. The guard studied the materials with evident interest, turning pages that showed futuristic architecture against desert landscapes, perhaps momentarily distracted by images so far removed from revolutionary politics. The first checkpoint passed them through, but immediately ahead lay the second inspection station, where documents were examined more carefully and questions became more pointed. A different officer, older and more senior, took their passports and began checking them against lists of names and descriptions. This was the moment Mendez had prepared for but could not control, the point where Iranian counterintelligence's search for missing Americans might intersect with the false identities he had constructed. The officer's finger moved down columns of names, and Mendez felt his heart rate accelerate despite his training in operational calm. If American intelligence had been penetrated, if Iranian security had obtained descriptions of the 6 missing diplomats, if any of the dozens of variables he could not control had shifted against them, this officer would make a phone call, and they would all be arrested within minutes. But the finger reached the end of the list without stopping, and the officer looked up, asking why they had come to Iran for location scouting when the country was in revolutionary upheaval. Mendez responded with the answer he had prepared, explaining that Iran's unique landscape and architecture offered locations impossible to find elsewhere, that political situations changed, but geography remained constant, and that Studio 6 Productions was committed to authenticity in depicting the film's ancient civilization. The explanation was delivered with a tone of mild impatience, the attitude of a Hollywood professional annoyed at having to justify creative decisions to foreign bureaucrats. It was a calculated risk, showing slight irritation rather than fear, projecting the arrogance that sometimes protected Western travelers in the developing world simply because officials expected it. The officer's expression suggested he found the explanation marginally acceptable, or perhaps simply did not care enough about a Canadian film crew to investigate further when he had more important security concerns. He stamped their passports and waved them toward the next checkpoint. The process repeated at each security station, documents examined, questions asked, answers provided, and the gradual forward movement toward the departure gate that represented safety. At the customs inspection, officials searched their luggage, pulling out cameras and production materials, asking what the equipment was for and why they were taking photographs of Iranian locations. Mark Lejic, playing the role of cinematographer, explained technical aspects of location photography with sufficient fluency that the customs agent accepted the explanation, perhaps impressed by terminology he did not fully understand. Cora Lejic, posed as the production's script consultant, discussed how Iranian architecture would represent an ancient alien civilization, a conversation so removed from politics that it seemed harmless. Each interaction was a test they passed through a combination of preparation, performance, and sheer audacity. Behind them, the second group, Henry Schatz, Joseph Stafford, and Kathleen Stafford, entered the airport and began the same gauntlet of checkpoints. Mendez could not see them from his position deeper in the terminal, could not know whether they were successfully maintaining their cover or whether Iranian security had detained them for additional questioning. He could only proceed with his own group, trusting that the preparation would hold and that the deception's operational depth would withstand scrutiny. The waiting area near their departure gate was filled with travelers, businessmen, and expatriates, escaping Iran's revolutionary chaos, families reuniting with relatives abroad, and the occasional journalist covering the hostage crisis. Mendez and the three Americans sat separately, avoiding the appearance of close association, maintaining their roles as casual colleagues rather than desperate fugitives whose freedom depended on the next 30 minutes passing without incident. The second group appeared 15 minutes later, clearing the final security checkpoint and entering the departure area with expressions carefully neutral. Mendez felt relief wash through him, but maintained his outward calm, knowing that they were not safe until the aircraft was airborne and Iranian airspace was behind them. Swiss Air Flight 363 began boarding at 7:45, with first-class passengers and families with children called first. Mendez and the Americans waited for their row numbers to be announced, joining the line of passengers presenting boarding passes and passports for final inspection before entering the jetway. This was the last checkpoint, the final moment when Iranian security could stop them, pull them aside for additional questioning, or discover the deception that had carried them this far. The Revolutionary Guard officer at the boarding gate examined each passport methodically, checking photographs against faces, verifying that visa stamps matched flight destinations, and occasionally asking passengers about their travels. When Mendez reached the front of the line, the officer took his Canadian passport and studied it for what felt like an eternity. He looked at Mendez's face, then at the photograph, then back again. He asked what business Mendez had in Iran. Mendez repeated the cover story one final time, film production, location scouting, departing after completing their survey of possible sites. The officer's expression was unreadable, his eyes moving between the passport and Mendez's face, as if calculating some internal assessment. Then he stamped the boarding pass and handed back the passport, gesturing toward the jetway, with a slight nod that might have meant approval or might have simply meant he was finished with his inspection. One by one, the 6 Americans followed the same process, presenting documents, answering questions, and receiving permission to board. Robert Anders, the most senior of the 6 diplomats, maintained perfect composure despite the knowledge that this moment represented the culmination of 3 months in hiding. Mark and Cora Lijek, married colleagues who had faced this crisis together, showed no outward sign of the fear that must have been coursing through them. Henry Schatz, Joseph Stafford, and Kathleen Stafford each played their roles flawlessly, film professionals discussing their work with casual authority. As the last of them passed through the gate and entered the jetway, Mendez allowed himself the first small breath of relief. They were not safe yet, but they had passed the most dangerous threshold. The Swissair aircraft was a Douglas DC-8, configured for international service with rows of seats that suddenly represented sanctuary after months of captivity and weeks of preparation. Mendez took his assigned seat and watched the Americans settle into theirs, distributed throughout the cabin to maintain the appearance of casual colleagues rather than a coordinated group. The cabin crew moved through their pre-flight procedures, demonstrating safety equipment and preparing for departure with a routine efficiency that seemed surreal after the tension of the previous hours. Through the window, Mendez could see airport workers loading luggage and fueling the aircraft, normal operations that could be interrupted at any moment if Iranian security decided to recall passengers for additional inspection. Until the aircraft began moving, until it lifted off the runway and climbed beyond the range of ground-based interception, they remained vulnerable to capture. 8:05 in the morning, the aircraft's engines spooled up and the pilot released the brakes, allowing the DC-8 to push back from the gate. The movement was gentle but definitive, the first physical indication that they were separating from Iranian territory. Mendez watched the terminal recede as the aircraft taxied toward the runway, following the painted lines across concrete that represented the boundary between captivity and escape. The taxi seemed to take forever, the aircraft moving at walking speed through the airport's complex network of taxiways, while Mendez's mind generated scenarios where Iranian security vehicles surrounded them, forced the pilot to stop, and demanded that passengers be returned to the terminal for questioning. But no vehicles appeared, no radio call ordered them to halt, and the DC-8 reached the runway threshold without incident. The pilot advanced the throttles, and the aircraft accelerated, pressing passengers back into their seats with the force of 4 engines driving them forward. Mendez counted seconds, watching through the window as Tehran's buildings blurred past, calculating the point of no return where the pilot would be committed to takeoff regardless of what happened on the ground. The nose wheel lifted, then the main landing gear, and suddenly they were airborne, climbing through the gray winter sky above a city that had nearly become their tomb. Still, Mendez could not fully relax. Iranian airspace extended for miles beyond Tehran, and Revolutionary Guard forces controlled air defense systems capable of forcing aircraft to land or shooting them down if authorities decided the passengers represented a security threat. The Americans in the seats around him showed similar tension, faces carefully neutral, but hands gripping armrests with white-knuckled intensity. 15 minutes passed, then 20, the aircraft climbing steadily through clouds and emerging into brilliant sunlight above the weather. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they had left Iranian airspace and entered Turkish territory, providing an estimated arrival time in Zurich and wishing passengers a pleasant flight. The words triggered immediate release of tension throughout the cabin, not just among the Americans, but among other passengers who had their own reasons for leaving Iran with relief. Mendez saw tears on Cora Lijek's face, Robert Anders's shoulders sagging as 3 months of sustained fear finally released, and Joseph Stafford embracing his wife Kathleen with the desperate intensity of people who had genuinely believed they might never escape alive. For the first time since November, the 6 Americans were truly free, beyond the reach of Revolutionary Guards and the threat of capture. Mendez allowed himself a small smile, the closest he would come to celebrating an operation that had succeeded against extraordinary odds. He had walked into hostile territory, convinced 6 terrified diplomats to stake their lives on an absurd cover story, and extracted them through sheer audacity and meticulous preparation. The fake movie had worked, not because Iranian security was incompetent, but because the deception had been constructed with such depth and detail that it withstood scrutiny at every checkpoint. Studio 6 Productions was real enough that officials who checked found confirmatory evidence. Argo was documented in trade publications and industry announcements that investigators could verify. The Canadian passports were genuine government documents issued through official channels. Every element of the deception had been designed to be verifiable because it was, in the most important technical sense, real. The only false element was the claim that these 6 people were film professionals, but by the time Iranian security could have discovered that detail, the Swiss air flight was beyond interception range. The flight to Zurich continued without incident, crossing Turkey and Greece before descending towards Switzerland's orderly landscape of mountains and precision. When the aircraft touched down at Zurich Airport, the Americans faced one final inspection by Swiss immigration officials, but this time the scrutiny was routine rather than paranoid. Stamps and visas checked with European efficiency, and passengers waved through to continue their journeys. Mendez had arranged for CIA personnel to meet them at Zurich, officers who would escort the Americans to a safe house for debriefing and medical evaluation before their eventual return to the United States. The Canadians who had sheltered them for 3 months risked their careers and potentially their lives to protect American diplomats would receive quiet recognition that could never be fully public, lest it endanger their relationship with Iran and compromise future diplomatic operations. Ambassador Ken Taylor and John Sheardown remained in Tehran for several more weeks, maintaining the fiction that nothing unusual had occurred, even as Iranian counterintelligence eventually discovered that 6 Americans had been hiding in Canadian diplomatic residences. The revelation, when it came, prompted Iranian authorities to threaten Canadian diplomats and demand explanations that Taylor could not provide without revealing details of the CIA operation. Canada eventually closed its embassy in Tehran and withdrew its diplomatic staff, a decision that ended Canada's representation in revolutionary Iran, but preserved the lives of personnel who had participated in the extraction. Taylor became a national hero in Canada and received the Congressional Gold Medal from the United States, recognition for actions that exceeded normal diplomatic conduct and entered the realm of genuine courage under sustained threat. The 52 Americans who remained hostages in the embassy compound would not achieve freedom for another year. They endured 444 days of captivity, psychological torture, mock executions, and the constant uncertainty about whether they would be tried as spies or released through negotiation. Their ordeal finally ended on January 20th, 1981, literally minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, a timing that suggested Iranian authorities' determination to humiliate Jimmy Carter one final time by denying him the political victory of securing their release during his presidency. The hostages' return was celebrated as a national moment of relief and pride, but the crisis had fundamentally damaged American prestige, contributed to Carter's electoral defeat, and established patterns of Middle Eastern terrorism and hostage-taking that would dominate American foreign policy for decades. Tony Mendez returned to his work in the CIA's Office of Technical Service, continuing to develop exfiltration operations and technical deception programs for another 15 years. The Argo operation remained classified for nearly 2 decades, its details hidden to protect intelligence methods, and the Canadian officials who had participated. Mendez could not discuss his role publicly, could not acknowledge the operation's success, and received no public recognition for an achievement that had saved 6 American lives through creativity, courage, and absolute commitment to a deception that most intelligence professionals initially considered too absurd to succeed. He retired from the CIA in 1990, finally able to write about his experiences in memoirs that revealed the extraordinary operations he had conducted throughout his career. The Argo exfiltration stood out among them as perhaps the most audacious, the mission that proved that sometimes the most effective weapon in espionage was not violence or coercion, but the carefully constructed illusion that convinced enemies to let you walk away. The story remained relatively obscure until 2012, when director Ben Affleck adapted it into a major Hollywood film that dramatized the operation and brought international attention to Mendez's achievement. The film took creative liberties, exaggerating certain elements for dramatic effect and simplifying the complex intelligence and diplomatic cooperation that had made the operation possible. But it captured the essential truth of what Mendez had accomplished, the audacity of creating a complete fake movie production to extract Americans from a hostile revolutionary state. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture, an ironic recognition given that the fake movie Argo had been created precisely to appear legitimate to Iranian investigators who might check Hollywood trade publications and industry announcements. Mendez himself became a public figure in his final years, speaking at intelligence conferences and universities about the principles of technical deception and exfiltration operations. He emphasized that successful covert operations required more than courage or technical skill. They demanded understanding of human psychology, the ability to construct cover stories that aligned with targets' expectations and preconceptions, and absolute attention to detail in creating operational depth. The Argo extraction had succeeded not because Iranian security was fooled by a simple disguise, but because Mendez had built a deception with multiple layers of verifiable information that reinforced the cover story at every point of potential investigation. Studio 6 Productions was not just a name on business cards. It was a functioning office with telephones and staff, announced in trade publications, supported by promotional materials and corporate registration that Iranian officials could verify independently. The Americans who were extracted went on to continue their diplomatic careers, though the experience of 3 months in hiding, followed by the terror of escaping through airport security, left psychological scars that required years to process fully. Robert Anders eventually became a senior State Department official specializing in Middle Eastern affairs, bringing first-hand understanding of revolutionary Iran to policy discussions. Mark and Cora Lijek left diplomatic service after several more years, finding that the trauma of their experience made it difficult to return to normal consular work. Henry Schatz, Joseph Stafford, and Kathleen Stafford each processed the experience differently, some speaking publicly about it in later years, while others preferred to let it remain a private chapter in their lives. All of them recognized that they owed their survival to the Canadians who sheltered them, the CIA officer who engineered their escape, and the bizarre plan to pose as a Hollywood film crew that should not have worked, but somehow did. The broader lessons of the operation extended beyond intelligence. Tradecraft to questions about international cooperation, the limits of diplomatic protocol, and the moral calculations that arise when following rules means abandoning people to likely death. Ambassador Ken Taylor's decision to shelter the Americans violated diplomatic norms and potentially endangered Canada's relationship with Iran, but it reflected a moral judgment that some principles transcended standard protocols. His willingness to issue false Canadian passports to allow his embassy to serve as a safe house for American fugitives and to risk his career and safety for people who were not his own nation's citizens represented the kind of courage that formal recognition could never fully capture. Similarly, the Canadian government's decision to approve the operation, despite the risks, demonstrated that national interest sometimes aligned with moral imperatives in ways that justified extraordinary actions. Tony Mendez died in January 2019, recognized late in life as one of the most innovative technical operations officers in CIA history. His obituaries in major newspapers detailed the Argo operation and other exfiltrations he had conducted, bringing public attention to a career that had operated in shadows for decades. Intelligence professionals mourned the loss of an officer who had demonstrated that creativity and deception could achieve objectives that force and violence could not. The 6 Americans he saved attended his memorial service, speaking about a man who had walked into danger to extract people he had never met, who had convinced them to trust an absurd plan, and who had given them back their freedom through a combination of meticulous planning and absolute commitment to an impossible mission. The fake movie that never was, the science fiction epic Argo, with its alien civilizations and futuristic architecture, remained a curious footnote to intelligence history. The promotional materials Mendez created, Jack Kirby's spectacular artwork depicting desert landscapes transformed into otherworldly vistas, became collector's items among intelligence enthusiasts and film historians. Studio 6 Productions closed its Sunset Strip office once the operation concluded, its brief existence leaving no trace beyond trade publication announcements and corporate records that documented a company created solely to deceive Iranian investigators. The screenplay, Lord of Light, that provided the foundation for Argo's cover story, remained unproduced, its ambitious vision of technology and mythology never realized on screen. But the fake film had served its purpose, providing cover for an extraction that relied on Hollywood credibility to protect American lives. The relationship between intelligence agencies and Hollywood continued in various forms long after the Argo operation. The CIA maintained consultants in the film industry who provided technical expertise on disguises, documents, and operational tradecraft. Film productions occasionally served as cover for intelligence operations, though rarely with the elaborate depth that characterized Mendez's creation. The mutual benefit was clear. Intelligence agencies gained access to Hollywood's resources and expertise in creating convincing illusions, while filmmakers received technical consultation and occasionally source material for spy thrillers. The line between entertainment and espionage blurred in ways that made it difficult to separate genuine cooperation from fictional dramatization, an ambiguity that served intelligence purposes by making it harder for foreign adversaries to distinguish real operations from cinematic invention. 4 decades after the extraction, the Argo operation remained a case study in creative problem-solving under impossible constraints. Intelligence training programs used it to illustrate principles of cover story construction, the importance of operational depth in creating verifiable deceptions, and the psychological aspects of maintaining false identities under extreme stress. The operation demonstrated that successful intelligence work often required thinking beyond conventional approaches, finding solutions in unexpected places, and having the audacity to pursue plans that seemed absurd until they succeeded. Mendez's willingness to propose a fake Hollywood movie as an extraction mechanism and his superiors' willingness to approve such an unconventional operation reflected a flexibility and creativity that distinguished exceptional intelligence work from routine competence. The hostages who remained captive in the embassy watched the revolution unfold around them, confined to small rooms, while outside Iran transformed from a modernizing monarchy into a theocratic, revolutionary state. They could not have known that 6 of their colleagues had escaped, were hiding in Canadian diplomatic residences, and would eventually walk out of Iran disguised as a film crew. The knowledge might have provided hope, or might have intensified their own despair at remaining behind. When they were finally released in January 1981 and learned the full story of the Canadian caper and the Argo operation, reactions were mixed. Some felt relief that at least a few Americans had escaped the ordeal. Others experienced resentment that they had endured 444 days, while 6 colleagues achieved freedom after 3 months. The complexity of those emotions reflected the impossible moral calculations that crisis situations create, where survival becomes random and fairness has no meaning. The Iranian government's eventual discovery that Canada had sheltered and extracted the Americans prompted denunciations and threats, but no lasting consequences beyond the closure of diplomatic relations. Revolutionary authorities were too focused on the larger hostage crisis and their confrontation with the United States to pursue extended retaliation against Canada. The incident became one more grievance in Iran's narrative of Western deception and interference cited in revolutionary propaganda as evidence that Western diplomats could not be trusted. The irony that Iranian officials had themselves processed the visa applications and approved entry for the fake Canadian film crew was apparently lost in the broader narrative, or perhaps simply acknowledged as an operational failure that needed to be buried rather than analyzed publicly. The human cost of the entire crisis extended far beyond diplomatic calculations and intelligence operations. 52 Americans endured more than a year of captivity, psychological torture, and uncertainty about their survival. 6 Americans lived 3 months in hiding, facing constant fear of discovery and execution. Canadian diplomats risked their careers and safety to shelter fugitives in violation of diplomatic protocols. Tony Mendez walked into hostile territory knowing that capture meant imprisonment or death, trusting that an elaborate deception would hold under scrutiny by paranoid revolutionary authorities. The Revolutionary Guards who inspected documents at Mehrabad Airport were themselves young men caught up in revolutionary fervor, believing they were protecting their nation from American spies, unaware that they were being deceived by one of the most audacious intelligence operations of the era. Everyone involved carried forward the experience in different ways, some with pride, some with trauma, all with the knowledge that they had participated in a historical moment whose consequences would ripple through decades. The story of how CIA agents created a fake science fiction movie to rescue diplomats ultimately transcended its immediate circumstances to become a narrative about creativity under pressure, courage in the face of impossible odds, and the capacity for deception to serve moral purposes. Tony Mendez could have proposed a conventional exfiltration attempt, forged documents and disguises without the elaborate Hollywood cover story, and likely seen it fail at the first serious security checkpoint. Instead, he imagined something so unusual, so audacious, that Iranian authorities could not conceive of it as deception, because who would fabricate something so elaborate? The answer was an intelligence officer who understood that the most effective lies were the ones people wanted to believe, that aligned with their expectations about how the world worked, and that could be verified through multiple independent sources because the deception had been constructed with genuine depth rather than surface appearance. Sitting in the Swissair aircraft as it climbed through Swiss airspace toward a landing in Zurich, the 6 Americans processed their escape with emotions too complex for simple relief. They were free, alive, and beyond the reach of Revolutionary Guards who would have gladly imprisoned or executed them. But they were also traumatized by 3 months of hiding and hours of sustained terror passing through airport security, knowing that discovery meant death. They grieved for the 52 colleagues still held hostage in Tehran, facing an ordeal that would continue for another year. They felt gratitude toward the Canadians who had sheltered them and the CIA officer who had engineered their escape through a plan so absurd it should not have worked. And they carried forward the knowledge that they had survived through a combination of preparation, performance, and sheer audacious luck that had aligned in their favor when it could easily have gone differently. Years later, when the story could finally be told publicly and the Argo operation became known beyond classified intelligence circles, people asked Mendez whether he had ever doubted the plan would work. His answer was characteristically honest. Of course he had doubts. The operation required too many elements beyond his control to align perfectly, required Iranian security to accept a cover story that was inherently implausible, and staked 6 American lives on a deception that could collapse under sustained interrogation. But doubt was not the same as paralysis, and operational success often came from pursuing the best available option, even when the best option carried terrible risks. The alternative to attempting the extraction was leaving the 6 Americans in hiding until they were inevitably discovered, an outcome that was certain rather than merely probable. Given that choice, creating a fake Hollywood movie and gambling that Iranian authorities would accept it at face value seemed like the rational decision, however absurd it appeared in abstract description. The fake movie became real in unexpected ways. The 2012 film Argo that dramatized the operation was itself a Hollywood production about a fake Hollywood production, layers of reality and fiction blurring in ways that Mendez might have appreciated. The real Argo was never made, existed only as promotional materials and trade announcements designed to deceive Iranian investigators. But the film about creating the fake film became a genuine Hollywood success, winning Academy Awards and bringing international attention to an intelligence operation that had remained classified for 2 decades. In some sense, Argo finally achieved the legitimacy it had only pretended to have in 1980, transforming from an elaborate deception into a real cinematic narrative that millions of people watched and discussed. The irony was perfect. A fake movie created to save lives became the subject of a real movie that celebrated the creation of the fake one. The operation's legacy in intelligence tradecraft extended far beyond its immediate success. Mendez's approach to constructing cover stories with genuine operational depth, creating layers of verifiable information that reinforced deceptions, became standard methodology in CIA exfiltration operations. Future missions incorporated the lesson that effective cover stories needed to be more than surface appearance, had to include elements that targets could investigate and verify independently and should align with targets' expectations about normal activity rather than trying to hide in plain sight. The Argo operation demonstrated that audacity itself could be a form of camouflage, that doing something so unusual and elaborate that it seemed too complicated to be deception could sometimes provide better protection than trying to appear ordinary. The Canadian government's role remained somewhat controversial in diplomatic circles long after the operation concluded. Some argued that issuing false passports and sheltering American fugitives violated diplomatic protocols that existed to protect all nations' representatives, and that Canada's actions could justify other countries taking similar liberties with diplomatic immunity and embassy functions. Others countered that diplomatic protocols were tools to serve human welfare rather than absolute rules, and that abandoning 6 Americans to almost certain death in order to preserve abstract principles would have been moral cowardice disguised as diplomatic propriety. The debate reflected larger questions about when rules should be broken, when national interest should yield to humanitarian concerns, and whether some situations justified extraordinary actions that would be inappropriate under normal circumstances. For the 6 Americans, life after extraction meant processing trauma that most people could never fully understand. They had experienced 3 months of sustained fear, knowing that discovery meant imprisonment, torture, and likely execution. They had walked through airport security maintaining cover stories that could collapse at any moment, facing Revolutionary Guards who wielded absolute authority and suspected everyone of espionage. They had left colleagues behind in captivity, achieving freedom while 52 others remained hostage for another year. The psychological impact lingered for decades, manifesting in anxiety, hypervigilance, and complicated feelings about their escape. Some found therapy helpful in processing the experience. Others preferred to compartmentalize it, treating those 3 months as a discrete chapter in their lives that they could close and move past. All of them recognized that they had been extraordinarily fortunate, that chance and timing had saved them in ways that had nothing to do with their own actions or decisions. The story might have remained an obscure intelligence footnote, known only to specialists and historians researching the Iran hostage crisis, if not for Mendes's decision to write about his experiences after retiring from the CIA. His memoirs brought the Argo operation to wider attention, detailing the planning, execution, and aftermath in ways that captured public imagination. Readers were fascinated by the audacity of creating a fake movie, the meticulous attention to detail in constructing the cover story, and the sustained tension of extracting 6 Americans through airport security that was actively searching for American spies. The story had all the elements of a thriller novel, except that it was true, documented in declassified CIA records, and confirmed by the participants who lived through it. When Ben Affleck's film brought the operation to mainstream awareness in 2012, it prompted renewed discussion about intelligence ethics, the role of deception in protecting lives, and the extraordinary cooperation between American and Canadian governments that had made the extraction possible. Some critics argued the film exaggerated certain elements for dramatic effect and simplified complex diplomatic relationships into clear heroes and villains. Others appreciated that it brought attention to a genuine intelligence achievement and honored the courage of everyone involved, from the CIA officer who risked capture to the Canadian diplomats who violated protocols, to shelter Americans, to the 6 diplomats who trusted an absurd plan because they had no better alternative. The debate itself demonstrated the operation's enduring fascination, its capacity to provoke questions about when deception serves moral purposes and how far individuals should go to protect people who need help. The ending remained remarkable for what did not happen as much as what did. Iranian security did not detect the deception despite multiple opportunities to investigate more thoroughly. Revolutionary guards at airport checkpoints did not recognize the Americans from descriptions that counterintelligence must have circulated. The elaborate cover story held together under scrutiny that should have exposed its false elements. Mendes's gamble that Iranian authorities would accept the Hollywood film crew at face value proved correct, not because the Iranians were incompetent, but because the deception had been constructed with such depth and detail that it appeared genuine under the level of investigation that security forces conducted. The operation succeeded through a combination of meticulous planning, extraordinary courage, and the kind of luck that cannot be engineered but must be hoped for when lives hang in the balance. The photograph of Tony Mendez receiving the CIA's intelligence star for the Argo operation showed a man who looked more like an art teacher than a spy, which was perhaps appropriate given that his genius lay in creativity rather than violence. He had saved 6 lives, not by shooting his way out of Iran or conducting a military raid, but by imagining a deception so audacious that it confused enemies into letting him walk away. The medal recognized more than a single successful operation. It acknowledged a career built on the principle that intelligence work required imagination, that the best solutions often came from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon was a well-constructed story that people believed because it aligned with what they expected to be true. The 6 Americans, Tony Mendez, extracted from Tehran, went on to live full lives, careers, and families and experiences that would have been denied them if the operation had failed. Their children and grandchildren exist because a CIA officer decided that creating a fake science fiction movie was less absurd than abandoning 6 people to their fate. The ripples extended outward in ways impossible to fully trace. Relationships that would not have formed, contributions that would not have been made, moments of joy and sorrow that comprised lives lived because someone decided that audacity was better than caution and imagination was stronger than fear. In the end, that was the operation's true measure of success, not the intelligence it protected or the diplomatic crisis it partially resolved, but the simple fact that 6 people, who should have died instead, survived to live the ordinary, extraordinary lives that survival makes possible.